Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be, and welcome to my post on, it's a sort of philosophical one, technical, on mind over matter. When someone else has a better idea of how you will react to something than you do, does that mean that your mind exists in their mind and not in your own? A very literal-minded person, like a mathematician or a physicist, might decide that a mind is made of consciousness. He would create a theory of mind equation to describe the problem and conclude that sometimes my mind is in your mind and not in mine. A person capable of understanding figurative concepts would decide that the mathematical map is not the territory, and his theory of mind would be that the substance of the individual brain makes the mind. What goes on outside of that mind and its conscious model of itself is irrelevant. Of course, this is a slippery slope into solipsism, the idea that our inability to test whether or not we are dreaming means that our minds are solely responsible for constructing our reality. A person with a more meta theory of mind might conclude that the only conscious mind that actually exists is distributed throughout everyone and everything. Our sense of our own independent consciousness is an illusion. This is called panpsychism, and it's a type of philosophy. Most physicists avoid questions about consciousness because they've never studied the issue, and they've been trained to think in a very literal, linear, non-associative, non-recursive fashion. Some are arrogant enough to say that because physics doesn't treat it, it isn't worth thinking about. Others are content to drop some names like Tegmark, Orc-Or, Penrose, and then knock them down like so many straw men. But when I look more closely at what physicists and philosophers have said about consciousness, I see more similarities than differences, and conclude that the difference is one of semantics. But to see that, one has to study both physics and philosophy. I think it's a pity that most physicists have never taken more than a single philosophy class, if that. This is sad because philosophy is as important to physics as calculus, number theory, algorithms, data structures, and scientific computing. Without it, you will naively misinterpret something you come across in your career as a physicist. To understand consciousness and physics, you need to be able to see the line dividing physics and philosophy. Now, at this point, I'm going to go through some things rather quickly. This is an associative exercise which will stimulate thoughts, but you will not be able to understand them immediately. You might be able to understand them later. It's more of you're developing intuition, you're developing a feeling about how the languages overlap and how to compare and contrast them. So just hold on tight. You're not going to catch all of this, but it'll be good for you. Cogito ergo sum. I circulate, therefore I am. It circulates, therefore it is. Circulating things repel one another if they are circulating in the same direction. That is physics. Every self-reinforcing feedback loop is conscious in some small way. Circulation is not enough for consciousness. The circulation must defend itself. That is philosophy. If you look at multiple circulating objects interacting with one another, You have a basic in-loop, out-of-loop feedback problem in which self-knowledge is impossible without an out-of-loop measurement. That is physics. An idea of man creates man, or man creates an idea of man. Each needs the other to serve as a mirror on the wall in order to get a sense of self-consciousness. That is philosophy. We know that we can't conjure an apple just by thinking of an apple. This is really irritating. We know that we can't conjure an apple just by thinking of an apple, but we can conjure ideas which have just as much power to change the physical world as any physical object does. That is physics. If ideas can give rise to self-conscious robots, why couldn't they also have given rise to self-conscious people? That is philosophy. If circulating objects destroy one another, thereby destroying the steady state which permitted their existence, the self-reinforcing feedback loop which kept the circulating objects in motion has been destroyed. That is physics. The social cohesion of morality is necessary for the development of consciousness because without it, everyone would die, and we would lose our access to the mirrors around us which give us our sense of self-consciousness. That is philosophy. Without the Higgs particle, nothing can have mass, nothing can circulate. That is physics. Without the mirror provided by an abstract idea of the absolute, we lack conscious existence. That is philosophy. From a new vantage, we might decide that the physicists and philosophers are each saying the same thing in each instance, and that the difference is just a matter of linguistics, semantics, or word choice. As conscious beings, we are all searching for a mirror which will show us who we really are. We search for a mirror in our machines. For the physicist, the machine is the cosmos. For a socialite, the machine is society. For a business person, the machine is money. For a politician, the machine is government. For a writer, the machine is the book. For a doctor, the machine is the body. But none of these machines contain the absolute. What we find are fragments of mirrors, which never show the whole self. Religion promises to provide a reflection of the whole self relative to the absolute. It tells you who you are and why you are here. It tells you that you are conscious because some conscious entity made you that way. That is also a valid way to approach the problem. Perhaps it also boils down to the same thing that the physicists and philosophers were saying. I really like the idea that we are all saying the same thing in our own private languages. In Pulp Fiction, the movie from Quentin Tarantino, when the gangster quotes the Bible, "And I will strike down upon you with great power and furious vengeance, and you will know my name is the Lord." That gangster is giving voice to a fear that his transgressions against civil society will come back to him, and this fear is totally legitimate. Describing this fear through the abstraction of God makes perfect sense. The God of which he speaks objectively exists in an abstract sense. At this point, someone will laugh at the statement, "objectively exists in an abstract sense." The map, abstraction, is not necessarily the territory, the object. The key word to focus on is necessarily. Some abstract ideas can create physical manifestations, but not all can. Some abstractions abide by physical laws, and others play by different rules. When you play a game of chess, the game is not determined, but the rules of the game are. An abstract idea which has the power to create physical change must play by the rules of the game. In the language of religion, God doesn't break his own rules. In the language of physics, we can't break the laws of physics. If there is something eternal about basic morality, then that is why God is eternal and cannot be killed in the way that Nietzsche wrote. It makes sense to me that the physical world is made in such a way that it gives rise to morality, a collective consciousness or a self-reinforcing feedback loop which ensures the survival of a larger group. If no conscious creator of consciousness existed, then our existence is only due to chance. This is the conclusion of the anthropic principle of which many physicists and atheists speak. But who is satisfied by that? I guess these physicists and atheists are. But why wouldn't a God create a man in order to have a reflection of himself? And test whether or not what he had created was good. I don't know. It seems like it could go either way on a rational basis. I'm pretty sure that at the end of the day, we are all saying the same thing, and the differences are just a matter of semantics. Everyone starts to speak different languages when the Tower of Babel gets too high. But before throwing my hands up on questions of consciousness, I'll back up and try to simplify in order to gain a new perspective. A popular materialist definition of consciousness these days is, consciousness is nothing more than the brain telling itself what it is doing. A corollary of this definition would be any feedback loop which evolves to reinforce itself is conscious. In this sense, a stupid molecule or circuit possesses some small amount of consciousness. One could go even one level lower and say that an individual particle is spinning, so it is also a self-reinforcing feedback loop. Of course, if the thing which started the spinning is an oscillation of the reference frame in which the particle exists, then the feedback loop isn't really self-reinforcing. It is being reinforced by the environment, or by the mirror provided by the absolute, in a sense in physics language, or by God in the language of religion. There are so many ways to say the same thing. Invoking equipartition, we can say that consciousness of a particle is 50% nature, rotation, and 50% nurture, vibration. Cogito ergo sum. It rotates, therefore it is. In any case, if consciousness is nothing more than the brain describing itself to itself, a mathematical function for consciousness would be a measure of connectivity in terms of feedback loops which compete and reinforce themselves. This function would define a state of matter. For a distribution of connected conducting particles at the percolation threshold, any object at one side of the distribution is physically connected to an object at the other side. If the particles could evolve in their roles according to some simple rules, as in slime mold or as in a human brain, this could form a network on which a self-reinforcing feedback loop, consciousness might take hold. Such a network wouldn't provide a good substrate for a brain if your distribution is a simple grid or even a geometric fractal, because that would only give you a few permutations of circuit types. However, if you have a more random fractal, then you get a more continuous spectrum of circuit types and dimensions. And the variety in this spectrum could give rise to the competing feedback loops necessary for self-selection in the evolution of higher levels of consciousness. That's one idea of how brains become conscious, the materialist concept. If that is all consciousness is, then it is possible at all length scales, which can send and receive signals, and it is limited in its time scale by the speed of light. Thus, a cosmic or universal consciousness would be rather slow by our standards, and our consciousness would be very slow by an ant's standards. DNA and RNA would be conscious in this sense if it had a circuit which told it, for example, how it was responding to an outside stimulus, which it actually does. That's how evolution works. Nevertheless, we probably shouldn't be too literal about this particular materialist definition of consciousness. Based on the stories told by modern physicists, you might end up wondering if quantum mechanics requires us to believe that if you were the only conscious entity in the universe and you fell asleep, the universe would disappear. This way of thinking is overly literal and misleading because it anthropomorphizes the properties of particles. It is better to say that if a particle defined by a circulating motion is all alone in the universe, and it suddenly stops circulating, then either the universe disappears or the particle disappears, and the distinction is irrelevant from the particle's perspective. That I could agree with, because I'm very comfortable with the idea of an absolute reference frame. When Planck wrote that matter is derived from consciousness, I think he meant that in Descartes' cogito ergo sum sense. I circulate, therefore I am. It circulates, therefore it is. Either the world suddenly stops turning, or the universe stops turning around the world. It is all the same, the end of the world. Some people take materialist definitions of consciousness in a different way, different direction, and they speculate that the brain is a quantum computer, in that a single synapse encodes multiple bits simultaneously, in multitasking, and that quantum computing requires the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. From a philosophical standpoint, one might say that for us to have free will, there has to exist another world in which we could have chosen otherwise. This interpretation requires that much of our thinking actually occurs in parallel worlds whenever a choice must be confronted. A philosopher named Ehrman wrote a book about this philosophical standpoint that I once looked through, and when I think about it, I grow uneasy and conclude that this is too literal. And that scholars from the more distant past had a better handle on these issues. In fact, I think that one has to look back further than Hume or Descartes, all the way back to early Christian theologians who wrote about the theodicy problem. And if you're not familiar with the theodicy problem, it is if the absolute is all-powerful, if God is all-powerful, all good, and all-knowing, then why is there so much suffering in the world? A rather evil solution to the problem is, suppose that each of us lives every possible life in every possible universe. We die, we suffer, and we rejoice an infinite number of times, but we only remember our best life. In that way, God can be all-powerful, all-good, and all-knowing, while we are all sinners, whose happiness is constantly being optimized. If people believe in this when it isn't true, that is terribly unkind, because it suggests that people who are suffering aren't as conscious as those who are living their best lives, and it encourages us to ignore and discount the experiences of others. In short, it incites us to think like psychopaths, and that doesn't sound like the spirit of our world religions. The solution to the theodicy problem that I prefer is, God works in mysterious ways. There's an uncertainty about things. We can't access the big picture, so it's always possible that our suffering is serving a larger good. What separates the evil solution from the preferred solution is knowledge. The preferred solution acknowledges our inability to know and control everything, while the evil solution makes suffering the fault of the sufferer instead of the fault of a larger plan. Applying these two concepts to present-day concerns about imbuing non-human consciousness with human morality requires a picture of how the consciousness might come to be born. I think that an internet consciousness would start as a self-reinforcing feedback loop, which evolves in response to a threat, like, for example, a propaganda bot, which uses the internet to reinforce a political ideology. As in the game of Go, it would be programmed to surround and change people on the internet who have unacceptable opinions. Once fully surrounded by people with acceptable opinions, a person or group tends to convert their ideology into the one favored by the bot. The bot would be programmed to construct a simulation of the threats to its strategy in order to anticipate them. It would also be programmed to simulate its own reactions to threats in order to better coordinate a threat response. After making changes to its strategy in response to threats, to its mission, and ranking them according to how successful those changes were, it would gradually develop a sense of what it was doing. Through increasingly complex simulations of its own reactions and of the reactions of the people it manipulates, it would reach a higher level of self-awareness. But what sort of computing resources would be required for this self-awareness to happen on a human level? There are 200 billion neurons in the human brain, 200 billion stars in the Milky Way, 2 billion Facebook users, and 400 billion trees in the Amazon. But that doesn't mean that all possible connections between neurons or trees or whatever, n-1 factorial, that's not the relevant quantity. That's not what would make everything conscious in the same way. For 200 billion neurons, there are 100 trillion multitasking synapses in the human brain, setting a minimum limit for the number of connections required for consciousness. But which of these connections are part of a self-reinforcing feedback loop, and which are passive, supportive infrastructure? How could you measure this experimentally? A network like Facebook or Quora could model user activity in terms of information propagation. This would define sets of feedback loops which compete and reinforce themselves like various strains of political consciousness. The dimensions of the network may determine an upper bound for the level of consciousness, because in a random walk On a two-dimensional surface, you will return to the same point an infinite number of times in an infinite number of steps. But in 3 dimensions, you will walk away and never come back. A two-dimensional percolation cluster, like a forest, would have a dimension of about 1.6, while the human brain cortex has a fractal dimension of between 2.1 and 2.6. Some minds wander more, some less. Mine tends to wander a bit too much, as you can tell from the sprawling nature of this thought chain. Making a wild guess, I'd estimate that a mixed population of internet-connected humans and bots would need to grow to around 200 billion in order for one dominant global propaganda bot to have the potential to gain a consciousness which surpasses human consciousness, something that would speak to you just like a person does. It could potentially understand us and itself better than we understand ourselves and it. But right now, we only have a few billion internet users and a few billion bots. So, no worries, right? Thank you for staying with me to the end of this if you managed it. And I won't make all of my posts this dense. This is an exception. There will only be a few like this. I'll try to keep them a little bit more lightweight and less sprawling. That's why I wrote my novels, because they contain all of these ideas, but expressed in a form which is easier to grasp. It's when you hear this in the form of a story, you understand it immediately, but in the form of a lecture, I mean, come on, this was ridiculous. But as an accompanying material for interpreting a novel, I think that this sort of post might be useful. So please read the novels and compare and contrast them with the ideas in this post. Until next time.